on Facebook?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. It says meeting is now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another virtual town hall with the Virginia COVID-19 Justice Coalition. Hello to everyone on Facebook, and I am lucky enough to be here moderating our wonderful panel with Delegate Rasoul, Sam Rasoul, and Sean Perryman, who is president of the Fairfax NAACP. Real quick, just I guess an introduction for me. I am from the Virginia Justice Democrats. I sit on the steering committee for the COVID Justice Coalition, and I am also a political action chair for the Loudoun NAACP. And as a human rights lawyer, I consistently find myself in the criminal justice reform circles and feel very honored to be able to moderate tonight. A quick introduction for each of our panelists. Although I doubt they need that much of an introduction to this crew, but Delegate Rasoul represents the 11th District of the Virginia House of Representatives. It's an honor of his lifetime to represent the valley that raised him. And through his experiences, he's realized that listening and helping neighbors is really what it's all about. He lives in Roanoke with his wife and 3 beautiful children, and he's continually inspired by the wisdom of his children. I love that. After he completed his master's degree, he became a small business owner and later the chief financial officer and chief operating officer of a nonprofit healthcare firm helping with maternal child health in East Africa. Equipped with an excellent understanding that leadership is a bold journey for justice, he organizes community leaders through the Impact Center, love that, and it's his own initiative to develop and empower new age leaders. Then we also have Sean Perryman, who is currently the president of the NAACP Fairfax. He is the youngest president in the branch's 102-year history. And he has been a leader in addressing the school to prison pipeline, affordable housing, and worker protections, especially during this coronavirus pandemic. And we should also note that he's currently exploring a bid for lieutenant governor for Virginia. He's a frequent speaker on race, equity, police, and criminal justice reform. And he's also been acknowledged for the work he's done with equity and technology and artificial intelligence. He earned his law degree from Vanderbilt University and works as the director of social impact policy at the Internet Association. He's in charge of their diversity and inclusion, and he lives in Northern Virginia with his family, and he's proud to call the community he strives to give back to every day. So thank you and welcome. Just as a refresher, because we always want to keep Governor Northam and Brian Moran up to date about our coalition demands, the Virginia Justice Coalition, we are all about releasing any person in custody who does not pose a demonstrable imminent threat of bodily harm to someone else. We want people to be released as soon as possible, and we are advocating for statewide and local decision makers to hold themselves accountable and share information daily with the public, because transparency is key. Kudos to everybody on this call. Our coalition has reached over 13,000 people statewide with this message, and it's been especially important for amplifying the voices of people behind bars. So yes, we are very lucky to have 2 justice-minded leaders who've definitely been outspoken on reform issues. Delegate Sam Rasoul, I would like to start with you. I think you're a little bit busy right now with a thing called special session, but we appreciate that you have taken the time to be with us tonight. And I think you bring a very interesting perspective as well as somebody who has dealt intimately with COVID-19. So please take it away.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. Great to be with Sean here this evening. Talk about how we can really move the needle. You know, it's not just about what we can be doing as far as winning elections, but beyond that, how we're actually going to legislate and how we're going to govern. You had asked me to share a quick thought about my experience with COVID. I'm about 7 weeks removed from that. Fortunately, it was a mild case, a little scary the first couple of days when you get the heaviness of the chest. But unfortunately, you're spreading it for days before you feel those first symptoms. And so when I got sick, I knew that it was imminent that my wife and my children were going to get sick. And in fact, I don't even know who had it first and who passed it to who, because it's such a tricky virus. And, you know, it does a lot of damage because of the inflammation that happens with your body. Without going too deep into that, I just wanted to share the 2 cents about it, because I can just imagine how scared and how difficult it must be for those, especially who are incarcerated. Confined spaces are just awful because of the what we call the R naught, or the ability for this to be able to spread so easily. And we're seeing that. I mean, most people are firm believers that this is a very dangerous disease. I'm glad that this coalition, which has quite a long list of folks, you sent me the list, and fortunately it just fits on one page. A great list of folks who are realizing that what COVID has done has certainly exacerbated a lot of the vulnerabilities in our system. And we have, you know, an obligation to be able to certainly think about our children going back to school, think about, you know, impacts to the economy, think about overall health and our frontline grocery store workers. And at the same time, think about everyone in our community, which certainly includes those who are incarcerated. And it's been tough because it's, you know, for many years, it's clearly second-class citizens, if even given any thought. And we've just had this infatuation with locking up everyone that we can get our hands on because of this prison industrial complex that's been happening for decades. And quite frankly, we've allowed conservatives to successfully control the narrative. And Democrats have been terrified to be bold when needed and really step up, because you don't want to be, quote unquote, weak on crime. You know, and so at the heart of the many folks of their faith, and what we see in our long history, that we definitely need to be compassionate and be thinking about how to approach those who are incarcerated and other vulnerable populations. Specifically to some of the points that you have brought up to mention that, I mean, with regards to releasing people who are in custody, I think what's been most frustrating for me has been the speed at which this has not been done. You know, I appreciate that the governor has tried to take a step early on back in April, but, you know, unfortunately tried to put most of the burden on the legislature to come up with a solution, when it's clear, especially with the breakouts that we've seen, that it would have been the humane thing to take swift, bold action immediately. When we are talking about, you know, tens of thousands of folks in Virginia who are currently incarcerated, and yet we have, you know, released up till now just several hundred who, quite frankly, you know, should have been released long ago. That's not acceptable. So the process has been too slow. I know we'll get into a variety of issues because you've broken it down into parole and whatnot, but people have a right to be frustrated because the system isn't working for them. And when you're talking about testing in these facilities, I think that we did see the Department of Corrections try to move quickly to test a number of individuals quickly. But there's so many problems there, right? So number one, by the time, so someone who's kind of gone through it, by the time some of these tests, and the doctor was very clear when I took my test, saying even the nasal test has a 70% accuracy rate. You just need one person, and that one person, depending on the layout of the facility, really can spread like wildfire. And of course, that is what we've seen. Once one person has it, it spreads. And we know likely how that happened. It's likely because of staff, of course, who brought it into the facility, passed it on, of course, unknowingly likely. But we know that was inevitable. And so the only humane thing to do is to take a good, long, hard look at this quickly. And I wish that, Virginia should have been much more bold to begin with, and that we can do more soon. We'll be able to do a little bit through a special session, but to me, it's in looking through a lot of the bills and the initiatives with regards to some of your priorities, which I think are awesome. I just don't think that it's enough.
Yes. Thank you. That is a very good and comprehensive overview. We appreciate your perspective, and of course, we'll dive a little bit deeper, but I want to give Sean some airtime as well. And you really do have a perspective of working in the community. So please let us know your thoughts.
Well, I'm not as diplomatic as Delegate Rasoul. I think that we've blown this. That's the only thing to say, that a governor should have done more, and he should have done it earlier. Some people would say that he was responding to business interest. I don't even think that's true necessarily, because, and Johanna, I know you're an attorney as well. I've represented corporations before, and you can have regulation. You can deal with that. What you really need in business is certainty. And we went from a period where we're going to be shut down for maybe 6 to 8 weeks, and now we're open. Now this part of the state's open, now that's closed. And it was a mess. And what we've seen from leaders on high, whether that be a superintendents or the governors or whatever, and it starts with the president, of course, right? None of us should be in this situation, but the president did not come up with a federal response. And what we've seen at every level is the people kicking the can. That I'm going to let the General Assembly deal with this. I'm going to let the schools deal with this. Mm-hmm. There has been no acceptance of, this is my responsibility. I need to make the tough calls, and I need to have a frank conversation with people about what we do and don't know about this virus. So now we're all dealing with this. We shouldn't be, but we are. And what we see from the COVID-19 pandemic is that is exacerbated the problems that are already there, the equity problems that we already see. We are imprisoning more people than any other country in the world. And that is a problem, whether we have a virus or not. But what we're doing now is potentially sentencing people to death because they are stuck in jail. In Fairfax County, where I reside, we were able to release nearly half of our prison population overnight, which says to me we didn't need to keep them there. This hasn't been some mass criminal spree or anything like that. But a lot of people are in jail and in prison because they're poor and can't afford bail. So we need to address this situation, because while this pandemic, there is a foreseeable future where we don't deal with it, we're going to still be left with the remnants of the problem that we're seeing that the pandemic has only exposed us to. There's a lot going on here when we talk about this. It's hard to kind of tackle this, because the other issue is, why do these people end up in jail in the first place? And we have so many draconian laws here in Virginia where we're over punishing people. And when we get them in the system, it's almost impossible to get them out of that system. So when I think about COVID-19 and I think about the lessons that we learned from this, it won't just be the virus. It will be that we have these antiquated systems that we had this failure to address. And that goes from everything from virtual voting for different state assemblies to the way that we teach people. And our leadership, rather than finally taking this opportunity, because in every challenge there is an opportunity, and addressing those issues, they kick the can. So that's how I view this, and it's partially the reason I'm running for office, because I feel that we need to address this and we need to do it honestly.
Absolutely. This is precisely why I was so excited to have both of you on a panel, because I think it's really important that we do have frank discussions about this problem that is so pervasive. And, you know, we have very narrow demands as a coalition, but the touch points within the system, within the prison and detention system across our state goes much wider. And, you know, we're sort of dealing with that dual pandemic, not only of public health, but of racism and a broken system that we've talked about. So I would like first maybe to touch a little bit on the public health side of things. We know that COVID-19 is not going away anytime soon, and it's certainly only getting worse within our detention facilities. Currently, Virginia is home to what the New York Times has dubbed the largest and worst outbreak of coronavirus in an immigrant detention center. And it was so bad, so bad that recently a federal judge has ordered that they stop transferring people to the Farmville ICA. I know that that is, of course, outside the purview of state legislators, but I think it serves as a really good example of a really grave example of just how mismanaged this pandemic is, and, you know, the dangers that people behind bars face, you know, how all forms of detention need to be considered at this time. And so just sort of to the both of you, what do you think can actually be done to protect people who live and work in and around detention centers from this pandemic? Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I can chime in. You know, clearly what we as a state should be advocating for is the immediate closure of these detention centers, period. We can do more and to make it so that way these detention centers are not welcome here. And I think that, you know, clearly we should stand up as a Commonwealth and stop letting conservatives control us and say, there's the boogeyman. You know, as a child of immigrants myself, growing up here in the Bible belts of Virginia, I've heard it all. You know, it's all kinds of things were said about me and my family. And if we're going to let that nonsense run the day, then of course we're going to continue down this rut. You know, the question is about how we're going to keep people safe in these communities. And the number one failure, when we look back and we understand the real science of how all this works, the number one failure of our country, which has led to the death of so many, you know, at least tens of thousands from this, is our lack of testing and the testing system. And it's unfortunate that that we didn't take this serious to begin with. And so coming up and prioritizing certain individuals who are in highly vulnerable situations, I think is important. And we haven't quite seen that out of the state. I don't know why as a country we haven't, you know, this is the richest country in the world. We can't figure out how to come up with a testing system. We failed from the beginning by not building that coalition with the WHO and bringing in some of their testing mechanisms early on. But I became ill with COVID because of the testing process. So we were, it's my fault. We met with an asymptomatic family member. So someone who was diagnosed as positive, but never got sick. But for that period of time, they were contagious. Why did we know? They tested like 5 days before we were meeting with them, but they didn't receive their result for 2 weeks. And then we find out after we're sick, many days later, that they were positive, and we figured it out. Now, clearly, I should have known better, and it was my fault that we interacted, even with face masks, with family members that we probably should have stayed clear of. But had we had a testing system that allowed us, and we know that it exists currently right here in Roanoke, we have the ability to be able to quickly test, and we're doing it right now. Virginia Tech students who are coming back on campus, which is questionable as well, but they're coming back, tens of thousands of them are coming back on campus. And we have a test that takes 2.5 hours to be able to tell, a really good test to be able to tell if they are positive. It just boggles my mind why we didn't take full advantage of the Defense Production Act at the federal level and force this kind of production right from the beginning, and then doing everything that we could at the state level. We're doing better, but doing everything that we could at the state level right away to allow for private labs to be able to really grow, as we've seen with this lab here locally. And that's what we can be doing as far as in the immediate future, making sure that we're prioritizing some of these vulnerable populations, especially what's in and around these detention centers.
Yeah. Sean?
Yeah, I think, I agree. The testing is essential. We do need better testing, obviously, but I think that we also, for those populations, which I mean, around detention centers, we need to reduce and release those people. We talked about that earlier, that what we did here in Fairfax County, reducing the jail population. And when we talk about detention centers, I don't just mean the federal detention centers or the prisons, I also mean the jails as well. On any given night, we have something like 28,000 people who are in jail in Virginia. During the pandemic, that it can be potentially deadly. 13,000 of those, about half, is they're pretrial. They're held pretrial, so they haven't been convicted of anything. So we need to start thinking about, how do we reform our system? Why do we need to be the biggest incarcerator in the world? We can do something differently with that. So I think all of those are important. But then we also need to treat our inmates humanely who are there by providing PPE and taking on that, because just because you're in prison does not mean you are no longer human, you're no longer worthwhile. We should not throw them away. So I think it's important that we look at, how do we reduce this population? We know we can do it, and we know we can do it successfully. And how do we reform our system so that we don't have these overcrowded prisons, jails, and everything else?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it boggles my mind, that we know that these kinds of facilities, they're not hospitals. And if, the amount of people who have tested positive in these facilities, we definitely need a step up from leadership at state and federal levels. Going from there, I think this is a very interesting time across America, in our state, as we are grappling with really what structural racism is and what it means. And I think, a lot of energy has been placed on looking at policing, and rightly so. But is there a way sort of to take that conversation beyond, to talk about ending mass incarceration? And I'm interested to know both of your opinions on, does this current political environment make broader prison reform more likely? And kind of, what ways forward do you see advocates in Virginia actually having wins on this issue?
If you don't mind, I'll take that first.
Please.
I think we've all been hopeful in this moment because we are having discussions we never had before as it relates to criminal justice reform. And we can't talk in prison reform without talking criminal justice reform, because we want to stop people from getting into that system before it even begins. That's why I've worked so passionately about getting SROs out of schools. That's where you see the school to prison pipeline, where so many young people, especially young people of color, are sent right into the system. And then once they're in jail, we're fighting a struggle where, you know, you really don't have access to them, and it's a very hard battle from there. So I think it starts with criminal justice reform. I think it starts with understanding that every problem doesn't mean you need to imprison someone. Every other sophisticated country seems to understand that. It's time that we did it. And most of our prison populations are on the state level. So this is not something we can just say with the federal government. We have to do it here in the state. We have a system that doesn't have parole. A lot of people aren't aware of that in Virginia, and we need to address that. So I think it starts with criminal justice reform. I'm hopeful that this opportunity has exposed to the general public that there are so many changes, but then I do look at the General Assembly and even in this special session, and they're still so reluctant. They're still trying to take these half measures. There's no reason that we had a pandemic that started in March and we're having a special session about all the things we need to do in August. And these issues that we're dealing with, whether police reform or criminal justice reform, they were here before George Floyd. They're continuing. We saw what happened in Wisconsin, and we need to make sure that we are addressing this. I've had a state senator look me, I didn't meet with him, but we were on the phone, and he told me that, oh, we're going to address all of this in special session. It just shows a fundamental understanding that these issues, they are so much deeper in that. And you're absolutely right, Johanna. We are reckoning with race and racism, and what better state to lead on than here? Because the concept of race as we know it in the United States started here. Our democracy, which so many of us are worried about, what's the future of it? It started here for the most part. So I think we have an opportunity here. It's up to us to seize it. The special session has me worried about whether we will do that, but I think we need to, and these problems aren't going away.
Thank you. Delegate?
Thank you, Sean. Lots of great points. It's really all for me very much intertwined. You know, as first and foremost, I was watching. You might be seeing trending right now. Some of the NBA teams are not participating in their playoff games, and they're protesting the death of Jacob Blake. And it's difficult. I'm naturally a person who has grown up as a consensus builder. Not necessarily as a firebrand. And what I have found is that without the energy of these protests, not just now, but even previously, without this energy, you just keep hitting a wall. And change seems to happen in stair steps. It looks like a curve, but it's really stair steps. And at these unique moments in time, we determine how high that step is going to be. And if you don't push hard now and say this is going to be a big step, then you will have a long period of time where the status quo will dominate. And these names might not mean anything to you, but watching one of my favorite coaches, Doc Rivers, just a few minutes ago, was giving he was giving some words to the press in this press conference, and he was like, we've been loving this country for so long, and it's just not loving us back. And boy, for me, those were powerful words, because it is true. It is true that people have a lot to be frustrated about. And your question was specifically around this political moment, and is it the time to demand change? And if you're going to hear people talking about how the change, let's start studying some real things, and we're going to figure this thing out over the next 18 to 24 months, trust me, that step will have plateaued out, and you will have lost the moment. And so right now, I think, is a critical time for us to be capturing this moment and getting as much done as possible and bringing people along. Now, I know you all have a great list of coalition members, but sometimes in some of this, we have to look for, and it's tricky from a political perspective, we have to look for unlikely bedfellows in building this coalition. And so, for example, I'm sitting here quoting, I'm a big fan of getting rid of qualified immunity. And, I actually love to be able to quote how passionate the conservative/libertarian Cato Institute is about getting rid of qualified immunity. Whereas 90% of what they're saying I disagree with in general. These are the coalitions that have to be built. And what is frustrating is when it's all turned into Democrat and Republican, because those camps don't always serve justice for us. In these unique moments, it's important to build that broad coalition. And you know what? If you're ready to serve up justice the right way, it doesn't matter, if you're Republican, Democrat, whatever it may be, let's build those coalitions and push for it now.
Absolutely. I think one of the most powerful things about this COVID-19 Justice Coalition is, there are all those different touch points, like you were saying, but until you all come together and push together, it's not going to create that momentum that is key. And we definitely don't want to not capitalize on this current moment. I want to just pick a few things that both of you brought up that I think we can delve a little deeper into. Sean, you mentioned the issue of pretrial detention, which is definitely something that this coalition has bumped up against a lot, because no one needs to be needlessly held in detention during a pandemic when they have not been convicted of a crime. And like you both have said, COVID has blown the lid off of showing the inequities built into the system that we have long known, but now can no longer ignore. So I'm wondering, there's no quick fix for a pretrial system that has been broken for so long, but in your opinion, what can be done? What can lawmakers do to reform the system, particularly in light of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think you could end cash bail. I think that's one of the primary things that could be done to address this issue that we're seeing these people being detained pre-trial. There's a lot of people who are toying with different models for that. I would stay away from algorithms and any sort of algorithmic thing. I think as long as they're not a risk to themselves or others, people should be released. And there are plenty of studies that show they're no more of a flight risk than someone that you had pay $100 or $500 or whatever it is to release them. So we have to keep that in mind. And I think that goes back to data-driven policy. I would say that these changes need to happen. And what we have to keep in mind, I always think of the words, I had the great pleasure of working for Congressman Elijah Cummings. And he said, we shouldn't seek common ground. We should seek higher ground. So it's not just finding, okay, what's the base level consensus that we can reach? We have to keep in mind, what is the goal here? We have people in jails dying who may have committed any level of crime, but we are saying you're going to go to a jail, a confined space, as Delegate Rasoul said, and potentially catch this virus and die. So we really have to rethink our whole system. Ending cash bail is one of the measures that would address that. But we have to be open to all sorts of new and creative ideas.
Yeah, alternatives to incarceration for sure. Delegate?
Yeah, one byproduct of COVID, negative byproduct, is going to be what we have seen is the proliferation even further. And you want to listen to the kind of the whole context here, but gangs are flourishing right now. And part of the reason is because we haven't, kids are not in school. And so we don't have some of the great things. I'm a delegate here in a small urban district. And when our athletics and schools and a bunch of extracurricular activities are important to really make sure that there's a healthy environment, relatively speaking. And it's really been such a failure of our in our response, but really this has really shined the light on how, as a society, we have just failed so many, because things can deteriorate so quickly. And so for me, it's clearly Sean's point about ending cash bail, figuring out how to do that the right way. Sign me up. I've been a big fan of and signed on to several of those bills because it's clearly built on a racist system, 100%. And then thinking about preventative models. So for example, in one city, not in Virginia. They have a program called Peace Fellows. So for example, what do young people, sometimes if you want to generalize, maybe young people, maybe males of color, what are they looking for? The sense of belonging. And so what one city did, developing this Peace Fellows program, is actually built a program that was led by the community, but that went and recruited some of these folks who are clearly on the periphery of maybe potentially these youngsters who are on the periphery of potentially getting involved and getting mixed up in things. So Shauna talked about trying to be creative. And what the Peace Fellows program does is says, okay, you got the guy in the person in the middle who's, let's say, the drug dealer or the gang member. And what they do is that they're trying to build relationships with kids in middle school and going into high school. And if you can go and capture those minds and bring them in to these constructive programs, and with a Peace Fellow program, you get signed up for weekly curriculum, you get a weekly stipend. They would do neat things with these folks, young people who are 14 to about 24. They would take them on a trip, for example, annually, some big trip to New York City or something like that. And the real, as you had mentioned, there isn't one quick fix, but trying to invest some of this money. This is the whole problem with the misunderstanding and people not really realizing what the defund movement is about. We clearly need some law enforcement. What we don't need is to be pouring funds into law enforcement where we could be creatively investing those funds elsewhere. And we are scared, even some members of my own party are scared to stand up and say, look, we got to defund some of this funding that's going to law enforcement and invest that. And to me, to your original question, this is preventative. Being able to make sure that we invest in folks before we even have to ask the question about what happens in pretrial. But hopefully, at the very least, we can be looking into solid measures like ending cash.
John, do you have anything to add?
I would just say, so many of our problems that we're addressing on the back end. And I think the delegate got to that a little bit, but, personally, I look at my own personal life. Me and my brother, my oldest brother, we grew up in the same household. When he was 19, he was entering Rikers Island. When I was 19, I was going to study abroad. Exact same neighborhood, exact same household. What had changed was the neighborhood we grew up in just had more opportunities when I was coming up. That was it. That was the sole change. I'm not so much smarter than him, maybe a little bit better looking, but not smarter. That's just what happened. And so when we talk about children who enter gangs and everything else, usually I look at that as a failure of society. And there's something that we're not offering them, that we're not enriching them in some way. I don't know if we need to do new things. We need to do the things like the school system and everything else and the jobs that we have better. In rural communities, when you're working virtually, if you don't have internet access, you don't have a job. So, these are the things that where government is not serving people. And, I'm reluctant to talk about people of color in gangs too, because we're seeing now, and we don't think of this as gangs, but all this white supremacy that's going on across the country. And it's the same thing. It's that sometimes as these people don't have jobs and they're being led to whatever they're doing. But I don't think this is unique to communities of color. I think it's when government is not providing the opportunity that they need, people will find that elsewhere. Anyway, those are just some of the thoughts that were coming to my mind as I was listening.
Wonderful. Yes. So we are getting a lot of questions in on Facebook. So I want to make sure we have time to go over them and
Sean, all the hard ones.
Yeah, we saved the hard. This is the real test right here.
All right.
This is a wonderful question from Anthony Peterson, who is wondering what state laws exist for the use of force in detention centers. And a lot of the things that we're hearing from inside, from people behind bars is, the use of force kind of really escalating, especially in these kinds of situations. So many more lives would be saved with actual regulations on this. So either of you want to take that question?
Well, one real important thing that we're pushing forward this year, and hopefully in special session, something that seems to have some traction. So if you ask the DOC, they're going to talk about, well, all of this stuff exists and to protect people. But one important thing that is needs to be kept in mind, especially with regards to law enforcement, but we do see it in the Department of Corrections, is the culture of, you know what, I'm going to look the other way if my buddy is doing something. And that culture has got to stop. We've got one bill that escalates this this year. But, you know, to me, that's what's most dangerous is this, you know, don't snitch on me type of culture within the staff, meaning, and officers. And, you know, this is what creates this, I think, type of culture where we see so many people suffering from that. And where would we be without the technology that we're seeing right now? I mean, how long would it take them in Wisconsin to release the footage of Jacob Blake being shot 7 times? Thank goodness someone was there filming it. And that's one bill that I've been pushing forward, is to release this very quickly. But you know, we need to make sure that there are firm laws on the books that if you do not stand up and say, well, here's what I saw, you're going to be held accountable.
Sean?
Yeah, I would just say what we need to do with whether it's police or jail staff or whoever, we need to insert accountability. It's not much different than what the delegate said. We have this culture now where you hear people back the blue and that sort of thing. This is common sense, good governance. If you are a law enforcement officer, you've taken an oath, you should be held to a higher standard than the person you're guarding in a jail. You should be held to a higher standard than the people you're policing, because you've taken that oath and you've taken on that profession. So that's what goes along with it. But there's a real reluctance to insert any sort of normal accountability that we would expect from any other job to law enforcement officers, and we need to change that.
Yeah. All right, next question from Facebook. This is a great one from Marilyn McCarty. The earned sentence credit bill will assist in reducing the prison population in a fair way because inmates have to earn the credit. Is this something that you agree with? And what do you see for the future of this bill? I think, Delegate, that's a little bit.
Yeah, I got so mad at this bill last year. So the bill was initially assigned to the Public Safety Committee. And I was so looking forward, because I think it's such a great bill. Actually, Don Scott had one, and there was a Republican actually carrying a related bill, but just not quite as good, Delegate Campbell. And so I'm read up on it. We're ready to go to conform the bills. And then we get a message. So this is the Public Safety Committee. We get a message that leadership has requested that this bill be transferred to the Courts of Justice Committee. And look, everybody knows what that means. It's going there because it ain't getting out. And so the motion was to report this or refer this bill to the Courts of Justice Committee. And I spoke out against it. And I said, I'm not voting for this right now, because we vote on motions. I'm voting against this motion. And I was hoping that we could grab another Democrat or two. It's scary to buck leadership to make sure that that motion failed, because then we could refer to a different motion procedurally, which would be to report it to the floor. I wanted that to go to the General Assembly floor, because look, if you've been doing your time and we can have the ability to be able to reward you and save taxpayer dollars, get people out early, it makes great sense. And of course, it was we lost 9-8. The vote was very close. Went to the courts committee, and another thing to be studied. Unfortunately, with all that has happened since then, it has gained enormous momentum. Fortunately, because People have seen the error in their ways. And that looks like something that hopefully will be passing here in the near future.
Wonderful. Anything to add on that side of things, Sean?
It wouldn't be relevant. It's just, the reason the delegate knows that when something goes to that committee, it's going to die is because we have a problem with people who publicly are trying to be quote unquote progressive, and they're not. And the same thing with the state Senate. Things go to the state Senate and all of a sudden they disappear, or it doesn't happen, or there's a study that goes on. We need actual people in delegation and state government who are fighting for us and who share our values. Because clearly we have a lot of people with a D next to their name, and they're not really on the same team as us. And we all sort of know that, but we don't really address it. So that's all I was thinking.
Yes, candor, please. This is very true. One thing that I think would be very interesting, because the two of you are very well versed in frameworks of racial equity and, systems of social justice and change. We talk a lot about, like you had mentioned earlier, Delegate, the lexicon used around any type of criminal justice reform, and how we have lost the hold of that narrative, progressives, Democrats, however you fall, because there is this, tough on crime kind of co-opting of what that is. And I think with and among a coalition full of advocates, what are some ideas that you have for ways that we can actually take control of that narrative, especially in this political moment?
The first thing is and this will be the only time I mention it, but stop talking about Donald Trump. These consultants think, especially, that people of color are just so stupid. They do not give the American people enough credit. People demand to know what you stand for. Now, getting into the actual science of your question, to be a big dork about it, what we've done is we've split up the American voting populace into 9 basic voting buckets. And voting is an emotional decision. It's not rational. Issues very rarely win elections. And you really need to look past, what's your platform? People are trying to figure out, am I being respected? Am I being included? Are you being transparent? They're wondering about the values that you carry. And so what you do is you look at these 9 different buckets. And on the left, we can talk to about 6 of those buckets. But many times we don't choose to do that. And we choose to talk to 1 or 2. And unfortunately, we don't build the necessary coalition needed to move forward. So you might argue, for example, 1 or 2 of those buckets might have been very passionate about the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment this year, which I'm glad passed, right? Well, without that, maybe that demographic of voter, which fits into about two of those buckets, we needed to say, all right, awesome, we passed the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, if you really care about women's equality, if you really want to help women, everybody knows the statistics are clear. To economically empower families, you must economically empower the woman in the family. So all you folks out there who wanted to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, now you have to turn to, what do we need to do to economically empower the woman through paid sick days, through all these different measures that are sitting out there? That's how you continue to carry this banner. And we've got to be able to tie those coalitions together in a creative way as we move forward.
And Johanna, your question was about the tough on crime, right? Like, how do we?
Yeah, recapturing the narrative from the more conservative.
Sure. I think for me, when I think about this, I think everyone believes in good government. Everyone wants to be safe. I think what we need to do when we talk about policing is stop talking about policing, but talk about public safety. Because what makes the public safe is different for everyone. And so the police, in some cases, for certain demographics, make them unsafe or make them feel unsafe. So we need to change that. And I think people understand that you don't always need police to solve everything. They can't be social workers. They can't be therapists and everything else. So when we talk about funding, what we need to talk about is what actually helps our community. In the schools, we are funding police to guard empty schools because we're virtual, but we don't have enough funding for therapists. So I talk about good governance. And when we talk about tough on crime, I think people, whether you're conservative or liberal or whatever, you have to understand that we cannot throw away this part of our population and think this is fine. We cannot be in an economy that's completely stalled and keep arresting folks and never have them have any realistic chance of entering the job market. So you can find what the person's issue is, whether it's economics or whether it's security or whether it's just being compassionate. That we need to stop throwing so many people away, because every single family in some way has seen a loved one or a relative or someone who's done something or been impacted by the criminal justice system in some way, and they understand fundamentally that we just don't throw those people away. So this whole tough on crime thing, crime hasn't been high since the 90s when we had Bill Barr making these sort of crazy laws in Virginia, and we need to have a realistic understanding that being tough on crime often means stopping the economy, breaking up families, and hurting everyday people. And I think if you talk to people that way, they can understand that.
Excellent. Thank you both. So I have two more Facebook questions that I'm going to try to package into one. Because kind of going off of what you were saying, Sean, one of the major things that we hear from people behind bars, all of the kind of anything close to anti-recidivism, like actual education and, traineeships, all of that has been shut down because of COVID, yet they're still required to go to work and they're still unable to social distance and, all of the issues that go from there. So these next questions have to do with how can we actually have better policy and budgets, even in the face of barriers like police unions, qualified immunity on the outside, but on the inside, not having requirements for prison guards. They are doing a service. This is from Renee Brown and Mark Laser, but there is no malpractice that they have to be held accountable for. There is no longer kinds of trainings for what they do on the daily basis. So with that in mind, how do you think we can start actually reforming from the inside? Like from the facility.
You're asking how do we I lost the thread of the question a little bit.
Yeah, because I'm trying to condense.
No, it's okay. So it's how do you reform the inside of prisons? How do you make them better?
Yeah,
really. Yeah. Okay. I think in some sense, what we're talking about earlier is not unrelated to this, right? Some of the reforms that we talk about, even for police reform or for prison reform, actually help the people who work there too. Help law enforcement, right? If you reduce the prison population, you're just dealing with fewer people. You have less you have more that you can do in a day and that sort of thing. Because you have to keep in mind, we have these overpopulated prisons, and we also have guards in there who are just at risk from the virus and everything else. They're not going to be given all that much more money to deal with that population. And they're probably dealing with parts of that population that they shouldn't be dealing with, just like our police are on the streets. So I think reduction of the prison populations is one of the main things, and that goes back into criminal justice reform. But I think it's also, I don't know if we as a society figure out what prisons are for yet, as crazy as that sounds. Are we there to punish someone? Are we there to reform them? Or what are we trying to do with that individual? And when you see things like taking away the option to get schooling in prison and that sort of thing, it seems to be more on the just sort of, well, we're just here to punish you side. So I think it's having a firm understanding of what we're trying to do, having fewer people that the guards have to deal with, and having set roles for something that when people come out of there, they can rejoin society, they can rejoin the economy and be a functioning member of our community.
Thank you. Delegate Rasoul.
Yeah, thank you. Sean brings up some great points for sure. I'm constantly trying to learn in lots of different ways. And one eye-opening book that I read many years ago was Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, when that first came out, and it really helped me to, as a non-attorney. You know, I don't get to be like you, John, but as a non-attorney, I really developed an appreciation for the power of the Commonwealth Attorney, and the power of, you know, how our system has been manipulated for quite a long time. And so when we think about this, I try to look at what other countries are doing and the philosophy and the approach that they are taking. And so, you know, the issues that we have, the fundamental frustration at the heart of those questions, people should really know the vestiges, the core comes from the slavery that this country holds, and our history that is very dark in many ways. And so, you know, when you look back and understand there was this period of Reconstruction, and so for 15, 20 years, we had many people of color, many Black Virginians who were serving in the legislature and then ushering in the Jim Crow laws to make sure that people stayed separate. That the whole point of this is to make sure that there is an us and them in society. And so I don't see this incarcerated individual as my brother. This person is less than me. And as long as I have that, I'm going to be fine voting that way. I'm going to be fine when the politician stands up and says, this person who is bad, who is brown, who this person deserves to be locked up and far away from you. And so to me, it is all very much intertwined, and it's important for us to, I think, take very much a systemic approach. If you want to get tactical, it's very easy to look at what successfully other countries have done, and treating their incarceration system as a reform system, as a rehabilitative system that is meant to do everything it can to usher people back into society as fast as we can. And so while we can nibble around the edges with a few policies here and there, I think philosophically we all have to be in the right place to begin with, or else this tough on crime narrative is going to continue to rule the day, because it's always going to be us and them.
Yeah, that's actually a great lead into what will be the final question from Facebook. I know you guys are on the hot seat, but we are here to learn from the both of you. You know, I think one of the challenges when it comes to prison rights, to prisoners' rights, is that you are having to be a conduit as an advocate for somebody who is behind bars, who is considered lesser, et cetera. And so a question from Virginia Burton is just, what can we do to better advocate for them and for reform? And, you know, I say any creative solution or whatnot, you know, this is the time we want to hear some visions, I think.
Right. I always say, if you want to advocate, you know, make sure you are there are advocates already out there, right? There are already prison reform advocates. There are already criminal justice reform advocates. Lend your voices to theirs. I think, you know, the amplification of, oh, I'm hearing this from multiple people who don't look like the people that are impacted by this, but they are using the same words and are adopting the same measures. As an advocate, that's the most helpful thing you can do for me. And I would imagine for any other advocate, the answer is the same. I think the delegate is absolutely right. We are dealing with the legacy that we have in this country of racial discrimination in so many ways. We've talked about the prison system, but, you know, the prison system looks mostly Black and brown, and that's true here in Virginia. And that's because the laws are enforced in an unfair way. I mean, if we look at just cannabis arrests, you know, it's more than 3 times, even though the use is the same. If you're Black, you're more likely to be arrested for this. So it's the way we police, it's the way that the justice system treats people. It's a lack of resources, it's all of those things. So if you are a white person, you have a lot of power to advocate on behalf of Black and brown individuals and say, I do not view them as us and them. It's only us, and that these are members of our society. I want them to be treated respectfully, but you have to advocate at every step in the system, and there are ways of doing that. And the best way, I think, is to find the advocates who are doing a good job of that and lend your voices to their cause.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just great points and lifting up folks. And I want to really take Sean's point and put an emphasis on it. You know, what my experience has been, this is hard for some people to hear, but the people who get in the way of people of color are people of color. I mean, I just see Black and brown people getting in front of each other and trying to compete for oxygen. And there's a great piece that I should share with you about someone saying, I'm, resigning from the Church of Social Justice. That's not how you build coalitions, to try to figure out, okay, who has been the most oppressed? Look, as a Muslim Arab person growing up in Virginia, I represent a small percentage of people here in Virginia, my ethnicity and my religion. And the reality is that there aren't enough people like me to shift policies that help to protect people like me. But it turns out that the policies that are important for me are also important for my Black brothers and sisters. And, I've got Sean right here. My job is right now, today, is the time for Black voices to lead, to stand up, to be bold. And so, it is imperative that with what's happening right now with George Floyd and all this that is coming to light, my job is to figure out how I can help those Black and brown voices that are well-intentioned, that are not just out there to grab some oxygen, but are well-intentioned. I have to do everything I can to amplify them. Why? Because when I amplify them, it helps to protect me as a religious and ethnic minority. And we all have to be doing that for one another. Building that coalition in a real, authentic way is the only way that we can proceed. And so for me, when you're talking about those who are incarcerated, not just representing these folks, how about these folks being able to have their own damn voice? Meaning there is no reason, check the receipts, there is no reason why people who are incarcerated should not be able to vote. I mean, we in Virginia don't want to talk about that because, whoa, that's crazy talk. Voting isn't a right. Voting is the basic building block of our democracy. And just because you're incarcerated doesn't mean that should be taken away from you. Now imagine you're incarcerated and your voting is tied back to where you would call home. So if somebody calls Roanoke home and they're incarcerated somewhere else across the state, they would be voting in Roanoke, and so maybe that would even convince a few people like me to keep that in mind as we are making policies that impact our brothers and sisters, whether or not they're incarcerated or wherever. So I think these are the kinds of bold solutions that we need to think about. And there are several states that already allow those who are incarcerated to vote. This isn't like a brand new, but we need to be able to step up and do the right thing here in Virginia.
And can I just add one thing? I mean, it's such a sinister system in the sense that those people who are imprisoned in those areas are counted towards those areas for resources and different things, but they can't vote. They can't vote in that district. So you're using their bodies and using them as accounting for things that come to us, but they have no say in the system that's there. And again, it just goes back to, we cannot divorce our current system from its racial origins, because we all know with Jim Crow, a lot of this was done to disenfranchise Black voters. And we look at our prison population and as Black and brown, and we act like this is a coincidence. We look at our police system that was started off in many southern states as slave patrols, and they're still arresting the same demographics. And we act like, well, that must be a coincidence. These systems are not necessarily broken. Maybe they're acting as they were intended to act. And we need to change that system. And we need our state legislators to understand that. and we need them to be bold and stop waiting and studying things. We have the data. It's always the same. I can go to any jurisdiction in the United States and I can tell you what the disproportionality is roughly within a few percentages because it looks the same everywhere. So we don't need any more studies. We need action.
I love that. I will end it for the Facebook questions there. I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Kim, for specific Zoom related and coalition questions. And then we will let you take a breather from deep diving in criminal justice reform. Take it away, Kim.
We just can't hear you.
Kim, I think you're muted, Kim.
Yeah, I think you need to unmute. There we go.
Good evening, and thank you, Joanna. It's a pleasure to meet both of you guys. Delegate Rasoul, I was doing my research on you and found we had something in common. We born on the same day.
Uh-oh, you're my birthday twin.
Yeah, birthday twin. And I dug down a little further and I see we have connections, ties to the state of Ohio. Warren, Ohio, Alliance, Ohio. And I'll leave it there. So to start off, I just want to make a comment about some of the things you guys have said. I think what we need to realize, Mr. Perryman said it best, maybe the system is operating exactly the way it was designed to operate. The other part of it too is that we have to realize that liberals are racist too. And this didn't all start with 45. We have to start really digging down into the core of what's going on. When you look at how we are back into a special session, we needed a session before George Floyd. Virginia had its own issues. And the Breonna Taylors, and of course, that is the pain in our community. But we know in Virginia, we have some of those names that need to be called. I'm the chair of Interfaith Action for Human Rights, and I advocate against ending solitary confinement in Virginia. That's not even on the agenda. And Virginia has to understand there can be no criminal justice reform without prison reform. They have to come together. And with that being said, my colleague, Gay Gardner, is on the line. And Gay has a question for you guys. Go ahead, Gay.
Thanks, Kimberly. I was glad to hear both of you talking about the importance of accountability a few minutes ago in response to a question about use of force in prisons. And, you know, currently there's no independent entity that's charged with overseeing state prisons in Virginia, whether it's the ability to investigate credible allegations of excessive use of force or other abuse of power by guards, or whether it's, you know, going into prisons to make sure that they're doing everything they're supposed to be doing to protect people against COVID, or you name it. But Delegate Rasoul, would you support legislation to address that? And Sean, do you have any specific ideas about how to achieve accountability?
Thank you for your question. I would happily support that for sure. I think accountability builds trust. So being the party that, I believe that government has an important role in our lives. And everything that we can be doing to operate with increased transparency and accountability further validates that government can help, not necessarily solve all problems, but can help us significantly. And that's another piece of the narrative that we have lost on the left. And so I think that this would be a great CJ reform initiative. And, you know, we didn't talk about, to Kimberly's point, solitary confinement, but I'm glad you brought that up because that's an important piece as well.
And do you think that enough of your colleagues would support, you either creating some entity or restoring the Board of Corrections authority over prisons to make that happen.
Well, it'd be dangerous for me to think about what they will do. I would feel like, especially in the House, we would have enough there. I don't know what the Senate would do. They are all over the place these days, and so I thought the trifecta might be a little bit easier than it is right now. But yeah, it can be a struggle. But the interesting thing about your point is, if it's framed correctly and done well, I would feel as though if it didn't get caught up in some partisan back and forth, that there should be Republicans that would be interested in that kind of accountability. And so we've seen that in the past when we had carefully pulled together a coalition that was interested in transparency and accountability and was framed that way, and not so much anti-law enforcement or anti-correction officer. And there is a common thread there that I think we, hopefully would be able to build the right coalition for.
Yeah, and I know you asked me a question about creating accountability there. I'm probably too honest, but I haven't thought about ways in prison specifically. I haven't thought of ways that we can create accountability. But what I can say is that we always look for incentives. And with law enforcement, if people are incentivized to act a certain way, if they know that they themselves will be held accountable, usually they change their behavior. And I think that would be true for people working within prisons. I usually don't believe in sort of zero tolerance, but again, I think law enforcement and prison officials are different because they are answering to a higher standard. And if they knew, and we could talk about what the burden of proof would be for these sorts of things, but I think I would support something like that. If they knew that they were intentionally abusing people, we shouldn't have them guarding anyone else. I think one abuse is more than enough. We see that happen with police. There are certain abuses, whether it's like sexual assault or something like that. One time is enough, and that's it, that you should be gone. So I think that's one way to insert accountability into the system, because if you want that job, you will be a little bit more careful if you know that with any sort of proof that you would be removed from it. I think people would be responsive to that. But right now, what we see is that, there's really no mechanism for an inmate to safely report even incidents like that. So I think we have to figure out, how do we have actual accountability, whether that's restoring the Board of Corrections oversight over that, and having a way for inmates to be able to safely report incidents of abuse. And then if those are adjudicated to be true, then that person should be gone.
Thank you so much. And being a coalition like we are, we always like to end these virtual town halls with specific calls to action. And so we have with us Danny, and keeping in mind that we are advocating for all sorts of anyone in custody in Virginia to be released during this pandemic. So Danny, can you take it away and let us know what we can do specifically to help you?
Yeah, thank you, folks. And so I'm Danny. I'm an organizer with La Colectiva and the Free Them All VA Coalition. We have been doing a lot of organizing support for years, particularly for folks who are in ICE custody. And so we know that during the pandemic, in March, there were folks, about 100 people at ICA Farmville, which is run by the private prison company Immigration Centers of America, who went on hunger strike because they were afraid for their lives because of the pandemic and the lack of care that they have been receiving. And so over time, we have been doing work to support their demands, which is very clear that folks should be released and that folks can go to be with their families and their communities, to be able to take care of themselves, just like all of us have the opportunity to do so. And so we have been calling and echoing the demands of folks who are organizing inside to call on Governor Northam to use his powers in this emergency to inspect facilities and to also shut them down and to make sure that everybody can be released. We also know that ICE has the full discretion to release everybody And so that is something that we also are demanding from them. And then elected officials at all levels to also take action and support. So far, Governor Northam hasn't been responsive. And so we ask everybody to call his office, to email his office, and to tweet at him to demand that he take urgent action in support of folks who are inside. Also, state level officials, there have been some that have made statements calling on Governor Northam to take action and calling on ICE to release folks. So if, elected officials can put out statements in support of these demands, that would also be really great. And then also reaching out to members of Congress, right, who are continuously funding ICE and CBP. And so we can call on them to defund these agencies so that we can really reimagine and transform the ways that we folks navigate the immigration system. And so that's the invitation and call to action to push to free them all. Again, contact Governor Northam, phone, email, tweet, and then also reach out to elected officials at all different levels.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Danny. I have put into the chat the link that you can use to follow the Free Them All campaign. And we just ask the coalition to do everything we can to support that work as well. As we near our end time, I would be remiss not to ask a broader question. Sean, we know that you are having looking into a run for Lieutenant Governor, and Delegate Sam Rasoul. There's been some rumors. I think it would be wonderful to end on really what you see as if you were to become a state leader, what can be done on the broader criminal justice reform and, what this coalition fights for.
Sure. I think regardless of whether or not I become lieutenant governor, I would still view myself as a state leader because I care about this state and this community. And just like you, I view you all as state leaders because we're all activists and we're all pushing to make our communities better. But I think my number one thing would be to legalize cannabis. I think that's one of the huge areas where we see disparities in the criminal justice system, as well as pretextual stops that we need to prevent. But I also think it's reducing the prison population, having frank conversations about where we're at. No matter who wins in 2021, we are facing two worlds, really, one with a vaccine and one without. And so we need leadership in there that's willing to speak up against the Democratic Party, Republican Party, or whatever. We can try to find consensus, but we need to be honest with each other about what we need as a society. We've had too much genteel politics here, too many studies. I just saw the Senate just voted to reject, to end qualified immunity. So we have a system where it's not inserting accountability for those in government, but we are over-policing and over-punishing those that are everyday citizens. So we need to make sure that we rebalance that. And that's what I hope to do if I am eventually running and elected to lieutenant governor.
Thank you for that question. I'm not as sexy as Sean, and I wish him well as he's thinking about all this and piecing it together. It is, true that for many months I have pondered whether or not I wanted to jump into the LG race. After my 7 sessions in the General Assembly, we've kind of seen a lot come and go, but there's a lot definitely that more that can be done for sure. And I guess it's been frustrating to see that many times it's not so much about, liberal and conservative as it is follow the money train that has gotten in the way of meaningful criminal justice reform and a variety of other issues. And to me, it's very intersectional. And I think that kind of intersectional justice is what we have to build as we're moving forward in order to build broad enough coalitions to actually get things done. Oftentimes, I have to catch myself because there's this kind of philosophy. Do you want to be right, or do you want to be right and try to bring people along? And so I try to figure out how can we bring people along so we can move the conversation along in lots of different ways. And so, as we move forward, that will be important for me. It will be important to really ask ourselves why, hard questions, why did we lose the presidential election in 2016? And if we want to put our finger on one little thing here or there and not really understand that it's a result of decades of neglect of people all across the spectrum, then that manifested itself in such a way where the self-righteousness of one tone pushed people away, and we lost the Rust Belt. I mean, to me, I feel like in Virginia, but all across this country, we are barely holding on to the Democratic Party. We're barely holding on to the Black vote. It's tough to find Black millennials or Generation Z who really embrace being a Democrat. We've got a lot of work to do. And I think that starting on the inside, making people proud of what government can do for them, building that accountability and transparency is going to be important as we remake this thing that people call the Virginia way, because it's so desperately needed.
And let me just say, as a Black millennial, I hope you continue to lift Black voices like my own as I look at running for lieutenant governor. So, but I think that's one way we can bring more people along.
Amen.
Wonderful. We have one last request from Facebook. Delegate Rasoul, people want to see your shirt, and I think they want to see all of the shirts that we have that have different messages around Virginia. Love it. So you can see this is what this coalition is all about. Thank you for that request. This has been absolutely wonderful. I cannot thank the both of you enough. It's conversations like this that keep us energized and engaged and willing to continue in what can be a difficult moment. And so thank you both for your leadership and for coming and speaking with the coalition. And we will definitely be following up should any races be happening. So thank you so much and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Take care.
Thanks, Dawn.
All right. Oh, wonderful.